With so many devices being released, the past few months have passed us by in a blur. And in the flurry of smartphones, some have fallen through the cracks and not got the attention that they deserve. The Poco X3 being one of them. So let's correct that in today's video and give it the full fat review treatment, C4E Tech style. Hey guys, Omar here from C4E Tech, and if you do enjoy my review, then please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell icon so that you get to be a part of our notification squad. Now we can't really review the Poco X3 without comparing it to its predecessor, the Poco X2. Now, I use the term predecessor very lightly here since the X2 does come before the X3, but in most aspects, the X3 is more of a side grade than an upgrade. In fact, that is why we find the X2 being sold here in India at the same time as the X3. So this review is more of a comparison, a compare review, or a revision. No, that sounds like revision. That's a different word. Anyway, chuck that. Let's start by talking about the most important changes here. The first is the design. The one on the Poco X3, that's entirely Poco. If it wasn't evident enough, here's the giant branding on the back. By the way guys, the camera bump, the entire rectangular thing within a circle, not a fan. But hey, that's just personal opinion. Now, one of the other big changes here is the downgrade of materials. We went from glass back on the X2 to a plastic shell on the X3. Now, it is good quality plastic, quite sturdy, but then plastic just doesn't feel that premium. Now, there's a reason for doing this. The Poco X3, as it is, weighs 225 grams. Now, that might not sound all that much, especially when you take into account the 6000 mAh battery, but guys, Samsung managed to put in a 7000 mAh one inside the M51, and that still weighs 12 grams lesser. So the plastic build was Poco's way of getting two birds with one stone, lower the costs and lower the weight. Now, if it isn't apparent already, I'm not a big fan of how the Poco X3 feels in hand. It's heavy and quite tall, which means two-handed usage is a must for this device. But hey, on the flip side of things, we do get a large 6.67-inch IPS panel. Now, on paper, this seems to be identical to the one on the X2. Same size, Full HD+, 120Hz and all that. But then the punch hole, well, the X3 lost the depth sensor up front, shrunk down the hole and moved it dead center. Again, personal opinion, but I'm a big fan of symmetry and this looks much better. As far as quality of the panel itself, there's not much here. Both are protected by Corning's Gorilla Glass 5. We have support for wideband L1 as well as HDR playback from YouTube. The X2 has a higher peak brightness, but the X3 can get bright enough that outdoor visibility isn't really an issue. While using the X3 though, it felt a bit more responsive than the X2. That though could very well be because of the slight increase in horsepower. We have the Snapdragon 732G here. And I know what you guys are thinking. It's just two more than the 730G. How good could that be? Well, benchmark numbers aside, the Poco X3 feels smoother. Now, one of our main issues with the Poco X2 had been the frequent frame drops and jitters, especially at 120Hz. It not only made the experience feel subpar, but it took the enjoyment out of the high refresh rate panel. Thankfully, the Poco X3 does better in that regard. Now, I'm not gonna say it doesn't lag at all, that'd be lying, but it was way less frequent and I had to really push the hardware to get it to stutter for a bit. And push it I did. I played Call of Duty for a while with the graphics settings set to high and the FPS set to max. And the Adreno 618 GPU inside was easily able to push 60 FPS. So amazingly smooth gameplay. We also get liquid cooling on board the X3 and that helps to keep the temperatures down. Now, I haven't really tested it out per se, but going just by feel, the X3 doesn't heat up quite as much as the X2. Also, this isn't in any way related to the performance, but the dual speakers on the X3 are really immersive. I really enjoyed gaming on this device. So on the performance front, the X3 does come out ahead of the X2. By the way guys, I kind of skipped over the memory section before, but the Poco X3, it comes with 6 or 8 gigs of RAM and 64 or 128 gigs of UFS 2.1 storage. Now to be fair, the Poco X2 does have an advantage here since we do get a 256 gig variant of it, but once we take memory expansion into consideration, there really doesn't seem like a big deal. By the way guys, we get a hybrid SIM slot here, not a dedicated one. Kind of a bummer since the X3 is over 10mm thick. As we alluded to before, the thickness comes mainly from the 6000 mAh battery in here. Now, battery life has been one of the weak spots for the Poco X2, so a 33% increase in battery does come in really handy. Now, during my time with the device, I wasn't able to kill it in one day. In fact, most of the days I went to sleep with about 30% battery life left in the tank. Now, I know it might seem a little less when compared to the likes of the M31s, but guys, I had the POCO X3 running the entire time of my review at 120Hz. So expect slightly better battery life if you're okay bumping down the refresh rate. The increase in battery life is accompanied by a faster charger, 33 watts instead of the 27 on the X2. Speaking of fast, we have a side-mounted fingerprint scanner here. Most of the times the phone was unlocked and ready to go by the time I had it out of the pocket. Even the face unlock felt snappy, which is exactly how I described the MIUI 12 on the POCO X3. Now POCO has kept their promise, means we aren't bombarded with ads, and trust me, that makes such a big difference. As usual, MIUI 12 is chock full of features, and now we can even choose between a traditional notification shade and a more iOS-like control center. And yes, this is the Mi Remote app. We have an IR blaster on here, which means we can control everything from ACs to TVs. It's really handy, and I'm glad that POCO hasn't removed it. We also get the headphone jack here, along with FM radio. And the X3 even comes with an IP53 rating, basically a water-repellent P2I nano coating that offers a bit of protection against accidental splashes. So don't take the X3 to the pool, but a call in the rain wouldn't be the end of the world. By the way, since we are talking about odd bits and bobs, let me put in a word about connectivity. The cellular connectivity was fine. I had no problems making and receiving calls over voice over Wi-Fi as well as voice over LTE. Worked nicely. Speaking of Wi-Fi, we do have support for the 5 GHz band, and the Bluetooth version here is 5.0. Leaving us with the last main factor, optics. Now, when the POCO X2 had been launched, it got a lot of praise for having the Sony IMX686 sensor. But the POCO X3 on the other hand uses the IMX682 sensor. Now, both are 64 megapixel sensors from Sony. The only difference is that the 686 can capture 4K 60 while the 682 can't. To be fair, 4K 60 isn't available on either phones, so on paper, both phones should perform the same. And well, to no one's surprise, they do. Here's a look at them side by side. Even by itself, the snaps from the X3 has to be one of the best in the under 20k price segment. Even if we were to pixel peep, we can spot a good amount of detail. Heck, even the night mode is pretty impressive. Of course, we do have a thriving Gcam community for POCO phones, and with that, the POCO can take even better snaps. Moving down the line, we have a 13 megapixel ultra-wide snapper. The thing that impressed me here is that POCO manages to capture a very wide field of view without compromising too much in terms of details. This is one of the better ultra-wide snappers in this price range. And we saw it in our Your Phone versus iPhone video, how good the pictures from the X3 can turn out. Of course, this is a quad camera module, which means, yep, you guessed it, two 2 megapixel snappers for depth and macro photography. Turn it around though, we got one of the best 20 megapixel snappers under 20,000 rupees. Natural skin tones, no over sharpening, and yet we can see the details in our subject's face here. The POCO X3 takes some good looking selfies, and as you guys can see, removing the 2 megapixel depth snapper didn't really make much of a difference for the selfie portraits. Like photos, the POCO X3 excelled at capturing 1080p footage. Nice and colorful with excellent dynamic range. And yes, we even have EIS in here for that added stability. It can go up to 4K, but we do lose out on EIS at the highest resolution. There's a vlog mode in here, and that seems like fun as well. Basically, the POCO X3 is a very well-rounded device. It beats out the X2 by a small margin when it comes to performance, but then loses out since it has a slightly dimmer display, has equally good cameras as the X2, and pulls over a big victory in battery life and charging speeds. But as a fault of that, loses out in the build section. It's almost like the X2 and X3 are meant to coexist together, be like the yin and yang to each other. Except that the POCO X2 starts at 15,000 rupees while the X3 starts at 16k. Now in my mind, I'd happily pay the extra 1,000 rupees for the better battery life as well as the smoother UI scrolling. But time now for you guys' answer. I want to know, would you pick the POCO X3 over the X2? We have already kind of established that the X2 to X3 is not that big of an upgrade. So if both the phones were an option, which one would you choose? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, like, share, subscribe. No, turn on notifications by hitting that bell icon if you haven't yet. Thanks a lot for watching till the end, guys. Have a good one. Cheers.